Okay, we are live. I think we've let enough time elapse here for Zoom to catch up with us, I hope. So if people are just joining here in mid-sentence, then you haven't missed anything yet. And you would not want to miss this one because we have today joining the CISO Sandbox, Barak Engel, who, as I understand it, is the originator of the Virtual CISO concept and the author of the sensational book, The Security Hippie, which he will be talking about today. It is sensational. I know you're a humble man, but it's a fantastic book. Looking forward to talking about it. Looking forward to learning the lessons from three different selections that Barak has chosen based on some of the hottest topics in cybersecurity today that these different excerpts from his book will have something to do with. So before we get into this, this is a Q&A, so please feel free to participate and ask questions as this webinar goes along. You don't have to wait till the very end. Happy to hear what you have to say as we go through. And Barak, so just to talk a little bit about you, Barak has served as security leader as a virtual CISO for dozens of major organizations like MuleSoft, StubHub, Amplitude Analytics, many others. His previous title, Why CISOs Fail, was a sleeper hit. It's been read by many people and appreciated by many people. And besides that, Barak, for lack of a better word, is just a really good dude. So Barak and I met about a year ago because of the Security Hippie, and I wanted to talk to him about it. And as we were talking, I also learned that Barak and I are both writers of fiction. And let's kind of jump off there. You're a storyteller, and the Security Hippie is full of stories. Why did you write and title the Security Hippie the way that you did?
Well, thank you for starting there. And thank you for everybody who is joining. I appreciate all the lovely comments, even if they make me a little like that. As far as Security Hippie goes, either I'm full of myself or I have a good idea here. But the concept behind it is that security is a space that is in itself is full of itself. A lot of people going around making big pronouncements and using big words and scaring everybody away. And I don't think it needs to be that way. I think security can be a much friendlier sort of field to everybody who wishes to explore it. And so one of the ways that humans interact with, in fact, the fundamental way that humans interact and relate to each other is through stories. And so what dawned on me, or perhaps I'm delusional again, is that the why not just go out there and tell stories, tell just stories from the field, not the stuff that hits the news. And by the way, news reporting on security is terrible. It's all drama and hail and fire and brimstone, but nobody really tells you anything at the end of the day. But we all deal with security all the time, every day, all around us. And so what I wanted to do is try to tell some stories from all of these dozens of organizations, the security organizations I'd led, from the dozens more that I'd participated in some fashion, and just show the funny ones, the human side of all of these stories in a way that I hope is very relatable, funny, maybe even a little stand-up-ish, as stand-up comedy, and just help us all relate to it and understand the field a little bit better in a non-threatening way. As far as the title Security Hippie, so I'm a brat, you know me already, Elliot. So I don't really, I mean, standards, who cares? Frameworks, doesn't matter. Security doesn't matter. Right, I'm that guy, and so hippie seemed to be the right word, not because of the flower dresses, not because of drum circles, not because of any of that stuff. It's simply because of somebody who's not really in the mainstream, and that's sort of where the title came from.
That makes sense. Also, hippies, free love, virtual CISO, lots of different companies you've led, spreading the love of cybersecurity. We'll workshop that a little bit, but there might be something in there.
Sure.
There's another tidbit about you I've been very curious to learn, is this thing about what is this about Pretty Little Princess, PLP? Is this something that people call you or you call yourself? And where did that come from?
So this is a nickname. It's my favorite nickname ever. It's like my favorite title. That's why I ended up putting it on LinkedIn too. My own employees gave it to me, right? And you'll probably learn why as we chat through this hour. But yeah, I mean, it's a great capture of my personality. I'm just a pretty little princess. But no, the real reason I go out there and just say it rather than being supposedly embarrassed by it, I love it. I think it's great. And this is in many ways I think influenced by American business culture, but it's true in other contexts as well. When you do something like that, you start with that, you lead with that sometimes in conversations, which I often will. Then what happens is that folks get a little bit destabilized, right? So there's a security reason behind it. Because now it's like, at least here in the United States, I find hilarious, of course, but it's the whole, wait a second, what did you just say? Wait, are you gay? What's going on? Like they're trying to think about things that have nothing to do with security. And with that, I have immediately achieved objective number one in being a successful security leader or what have you in any conversation, which is I've taken you out of the fear and into curiosity. And if I've taken you out of the fear and into curiosity, I've already, cut through the first 2 hours of conversation and getting to know each other. So I find it to be a very useful technique in that respect. If I am to pull the curtain, kind of the man behind the curtain, that's the security reason behind it. Other than the fact that, of course, I really love that nickname. That tells you so much about our own organization.
That's great. Appreciate that story. I was definitely curious about it myself. And so now I'm in that zone that you were hoping to get me in.
There you go.
All right. Well, hey, let's get into the Security Hippie. So we have a couple selections here. Let's start with, tell me about Dudley. So who is Dudley and what's going on here?
So Dudley was a customer, one of my earlier customers. When I was, in fact, Dudley became a customer before I even had a company. Just like many entrepreneurs, I started by myself and was a sole proprietor for a while. So this was a customer that I picked up during that period, but stayed through the transition into a corporation. And a lovely fella and a really good guy. And we had created a strong bond. And Dudley was very respectful of my need for a little bit of a reset every year. And so he knew, even though he used me as a virtual CISO for his organization and constantly had things to talk to me about, I knew that I needed a little bit of a reset every year. There's a convention I go to in Dallas every year that I really love to go to. I won't tell you more because there's a bit of a riddle in the book about that convention. So I don't want to go into too much
mysterious. Detail. Okay.
Right. And I think the most important thing about Dudley and his organization is that, and Dudley is a fake name, of course, is that that was the first place where a security program was put together. If I would say comprehensively according to the principles that ultimately became the ones that Immune uses everywhere, my company uses everywhere with all of our customers. So this is like the first place, and it was a very large organization where all of these principles were put in place. And so in that sense, Dudley, as the C-level executive that was our sponsor, was really a really important customer for me and for my company down the road, because it's the first test, the real test case of things. And the story I'm about to share with you, the little excerpt I'm about to share with you, is not a story of a great success. It's actually a story of failure. It's a place where I screwed up, and I'm glad that Dudley had the sense to not just follow my word blindly, if you will. And it turned out fine. And Dudley, the company remained a customer for a decade afterwards. So this is not a bad thing. But it also illustrates, other than the issue of incident response, which is a really big deal right now in disaster recovery, it also illustrates that CISOs don't necessarily have to be fired the moment that a bad thing happens. Another big problem in the industry. So it kind of covers two topics. But let's jump into the excerpt. Is that okay?
Yeah, please, let's do.
All right. It was a Thursday evening, 1 week before Thanksgiving, and I was in Dallas attending my favorite conference, as I do every year. A new event was about to start when my phone lit up with an incoming call from Dudley. And because he was an important client, I stepped aside to a relatively quiet corner and picked it up. Barak, listen, I would never bother you like this, except I really need you to help me figure out something. He knew this was my break time and how essential it was to my mental stability. And so I knew this had to be important. I got this weird incoming message on LinkedIn from some company in Europe I never heard of, who said that they may have seen chatter about our company being targeted by hackers, and I don't know what to make of it. Is it someone you know or a complete stranger? I asked. Stranger. But what they did say they knew our CEO. Did they give you any information at all beyond that intro? Nope. They said I should reach out to them if I wanted to get it. Sounds like some elaborate social engineering deal to me, I mused. But it sounded like nothing I'd ever seen before. We agreed that he would ask them for more information and also verify with the CEO their claim of knowing him, and we can talk about it again. We hung up and I went back to the event. You will note that my own response was mostly suspicious rather than alarmed. I'm not patting myself on the back here because it turns out that the reach out was indeed legitimate, came from a player in the extremely new, back then, commercial threat intelligence field, and was completely honest in that the only reason they did it and offered Dudley this valuable insight for free was because their CEO knew the CEO of Dudley's company personally. In other words, I initially read this all wrong. To be even more candid, being where I was, my desire to get back to my fun activities was also extremely strong, probably further reinforcing my tendency to initially view this message as suspect. I really, really didn't want it to be real, and I therefore quickly determined that it likely wasn't real, thereby mirroring the decision-making progress made by many before me and many, many since and forevermore, when a crisis was unfolding in front of their very eyes. My highly developed gut sense failed me, and as a result, I almost failed Dudley.
Wow. So first of all, great excerpt. And the thing about your book that is so different from anything else I've read in cybersecurity is that you courageously and fearlessly discuss some embarrassing moments, some things that aren't just about how you're this shining knight with a suit of armor of like, Matrix code. You're a human being. Human beings are making mistakes. So first of all, kudos to you for that. What did you learn from this experience? You said there in the end, but what's going on with incident response now that you think that this, today makes this story so relevant?
Oh, I think there's a bunch of things to take from this. And by the way, yes, I'm no knight in shining armor. I am just human. So thank you for picking up on that. I appreciate it. It's part of why Security Hippie was written. At the end of the day, I think that the biggest problem I see right now, everybody's talking about incident response. Everybody's talking about disaster recovery. It's become the term du jour in security. And in fact, kudos to Dick Clark and Rob Nackey, who wrote the Fifth Domain, where they talk about cyber resilience in very grand sort of terms. But the response, as it always seems to be in security, is more tech. We're going to solve this with more technology. We're going to deploy more technology that's going to, somehow help us deal with this stuff. And solve our incident response and solve our this and solve our that. And the reality is, when something's developing, especially if it's a breach that's developing, by the way, this story turned out into a breach. It led to another fascinating story, which is also in Security Hippie, where I was, we all do these red team, blue team exercises. This turned out into a real live with actual professional hackers on the other side red team exercise. We were fighting them in real time. So, it's a great little story. I just read you a tiny little excerpt from it. But you can see where the critical bits, and this is something we're going to talk about, I think, this hour a few more times, is the critical bits are always human. It's always the human judgment that comes into play. It's always the decision making that's done by folks in some form of authority position to make that judgment, and the judgment often is wrong. And what's interesting is the more you've done things, the more experience you have, your judgment tends to get better. but it tends to fail more spectacularly. Because by the time that something, you're right more often than not, and then you're right even more often than not, and even more often than not, then when you're wrong, it's very hard to convince you that you're wrong. And I think this was the big message I was trying to send here. When something like this happens, and even if you have very experienced people at the top, the cross-checking of the human aspect, the human element of this, is far more critical in terms of kind of navigating the situation than it is about which dashboard am I going to open now to look into, right? That's not the thing that's gonna make it work out. At the end of the day, it's going to be the judgment of the people involved. So I think this is an important point generally in security. You can't constantly chase tech to make decisions for you, because tech is not going to make decisions for you when those decisions really matter. You can pretend that it will, but it never will. It will most of the time, because most of the time the decisions don't really matter. And that's the thing I think people tend to ignore a lot, or like to ignore a lot. But at the end of the day, most of the decisions we make are immaterial. Ever so often, a big one comes about. And it's even sometimes hard to tease out which one is which.
Right. I don't know if now's the time to get into this even further, but with incident response being, sometimes kind of the center of an entire strategy behind a cybersecurity program, there's people, process, technology, right? It sounds like you were really looking at the people. How do you do that? Are we going to answer that later on, or do we look at that? Is that something that you do have some kind of a really good haiku or piece of Yoda wisdom for us now, as far as like, how do you get the people to rise to the occasion when there's an incident to respond to?
Oh boy. I don't know if you've ever been in a breach scenario, or
No, I've not.
even a suspected breach scenario. I have had the distinct
Suspected,
pleasure
yes.
of being, yeah. All right. I've been in several. I don't even want to name how many. I don't have enough fingers. And so here's what typically happens. First of all, people panic, right? You know the definition of panic, right? The theater is burning, but somebody thinks that there's still a window open. That's when the panic happens in psychology, right? When all the exits are closed, everybody suddenly magically calms down and starts thinking their way of how to get out of the theater in a very collaborative way. But the stampede happens when there's still a window to get out. So the first thing that happens is, because it's developing, everybody thinks there's a way to get out. So the stampede happens. And the role, and I can tell you, having been in the scenario many times, it really turns people off to the security leader unless they really, really trust you. And even then they're like, what's going on, right? Because your job at that point is not to be the big acting person. You're not the big action person. You actually need to be the one that's sitting back there with, virtually smoking a cigar, having a little, scotch, and say, okay, calm down, chill, right? So the first thing you have to do is to be the person that has the ability to remain calm in this situation, so that your decision making is not driven by constant bits of random data that's thrown at you. And that's really, really hard to do. It's really hard to do, especially if you've never experienced it. And so I can't, I don't think it's something you can really teach. It is something that can be learned over time. And the truth of the matter is that most of the time, most of the people, most of their lives, even if they work in security, even if they work in incident response, they're not going to end up with a live real red team exercise. That typically only comes if you're, sitting in environments that are constantly being broken by threat actors, governments, NSAs, what have you. The second thing that matters, after you're able to develop that response, which is, okay, let's respond to this calmly and measuredly, if you will, is the process of making those decisions at that point need to involve the right group of people. But there needs to be, and I think that's the most important thing that people miss out when they try to develop incident response, there needs to be a clear chain of command in terms of decision making, because you're gonna have a lot of people with a lot of opinions, founded or not. Some people are louder than others, so you need to know how to poll the ones that aren't speaking loudly. And there's going to be a lot of opinions, but there's got to be a clear decision-making chain, because somebody needs to be there and make the decisions when all these things are moving and there's a lot of variables and we don't know what's actually going on, right? All of these things happen in real time and they're very difficult to deal with. So you have to remain calm and you have to have a clear chain of command. Once you kind of have these buttoned down, and again, this requires experience and exposure and, and sort of it's a learned skill, then incidents aren't that big of a deal, ultimately. You'll deal with them. It's not going to be how much technology you have in place. I guarantee you that. The technology is not going to be that. Yes, sure, there's some basic measures you want to put in place. You're a SaaS company. I always ask questions. This question for folks when they have a SaaS or PaaS company is like, have you created a separate account next to the one that runs your production platform with completely different credentials that nobody else in the company shares? And do you do like a daily dump into that account, right? Just cold storage, copy of the platform so that you don't end up, like code spaces when a hacker took their root account, deleted the company out of existence, and essentially caused it to shut its doors, right? Have you done that? 99% of your risk is now gone. Operational risk is now gone. Because even if the worst happens and the entire thing disappears, you just switch over to the other account and you're running again, right? You haven't interrupted your services. People don't do that, but they'll invest in ever more, intimate ways of poking at their code and their infrastructure to deal with ever more esoteric threats. Can we deal with the big stuff first? Can we think about these things? So yeah, those are the key. I think that's the key aspect of this that I'd like to get across.
Yeah, well said. And people, it's about the people.
It's always about the people.
Back to the people.
I always like to say, it doesn't matter how good your technical defenses are. If I can manipulate the operators of your systems, then your systems are irrelevant. Operators being the humans that are managing this infrastructure. That's why social engineering is so powerful. I don't care what defenses you have. If I can manipulate the human operating the defenses are irrelevant. They're immaterial. Literally immaterial. They have no purpose or benefit whatsoever. Perhaps something to think about.
Absolutely. Well, that is kind of a germane to this discussion is the fact that, so this is a vendor neutral webinar, but Hawksun is an awareness platform. Mm-hmm. Security awareness, we're going a little off script here, but where are you at with security awareness these days? How do you tell your clients, you have dozens of them, how do you tell them what to do with security awareness? Should you punish them until they're crying and they'll never click the thing again, or do you go about it a different way? By the way, everyone, Barak is not a user of Hawksun, so this is not this is just Barak's idea of about security awareness and training.
Which is fair. I do like what you guys do because it answers directly the. Let me ask you this question. People hate security. Oh no. And do you believe that if we go and tell people all the time how bad they are at security and punish them for being bad at security and set up traps for them to fail and feel bad about themselves about security so that we can come back, smugly and say, oh, you failed your test or whatever it might be. And we end up wondering why people have a negative internal strong gut reaction to anything to do with security. Does that sound surprising? The entire approach that so much of the industry is taking with teaching security is a not just a prescription for failure. It's a prescription for continuing and persistent failure. You're teaching people to hate everything to do with security, even if it doesn't have anything to do with security. If it sounds like security, they're going to now hate it. And we're doing this to ourselves. So lots of problems with awareness. And again, I've shared a couple of stories in this book. I talk about it a lot in my first book. It's, you got to be people forward, right? And people forward means, there's lots of studies around this too, lots of known aspects of psychology. To balance out negative and positive feedback, generally humans need about 10 pieces of positive feedback for every 1 bit of negative feedback, 10 to 1. So if all you're going in all you're going in with is a balanced approach of 1-to-1, you're basically going in super negative, right?
Yeah.
You're going in 1,000% more negative than you need to, and yet so many people, so many practitioners in the security field go in with the negative. They lead with the negative. It's always the negative, right? And that doesn't work. It doesn't work. I mean, awareness is where it doesn't work the most, because that's where you're dealing with people the most in the whole thing, in the kind of like the ecosystem of security. So what do we tell customers? We tend to be, we tend to cast a doubtful eye towards awareness. Yes, we do like things. I like your platform because it's very positive. And I love the reward system. I love the like encouragement rather than the beating people down. That is an insight that I think is very valuable, and why what you're doing is I think much more powerful than and I'm sure your engagement rates will show that. That's kind of how I would judge it. I don't know, but I'm suspecting that you have higher engagement with people over time because you're doing the positive rather than the negative. At the same time, I do like the little short videos that Ninja makes, because they're cute and they're approachable, and they're they're easy for folks to consume without like getting too much of that initial screen of like, holy shit, that's security training. I don't know. All right. So these kinds of approaches are good. The approach of sending phishing emails and catching people doing the wrong thing and then teaching them how to do the right thing, that's fundamentally the wrong approach to deal with things, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. Great knowledge there. I'll send you something that my team and I put together called the Behavioral Cybersecurity Statistics Report. And when you say engagement rates, it's pretty insane how high they are. When you send out 36 phishing simulations where it's like, yay, I actually reported it and they rewarded me for reporting. That makes me feel good, as opposed to, you failed, you suck, you're going to get put in a phishing prison and maybe fired and publicly shamed. Imagine if people would disengage then. Like it's really, it's not that shocking, I suppose.
Well, can I share a little story? It's not in any of the books.
Please
but
do.
It's a little story. Yeah, this is when I was first head of security in any company. That was my last full-time corporate job too. But we had a persistent virus infection happening at a place in a go-to-market team, and so eventually we tracked it down to one user who was constantly like creating these virus infections. Our anti-malware things were catching them, right? Antivirus. So we took him for an interview, right? And I'm interviewing him, and I say, hey, what's happening? Why is this happening? Like, why do you keep getting like these virus infections? And he says, well, I'm curious. I'm like, what do you mean I'm curious? Well, when I get one that I think is a virus, I click on it because I want to see what it's going to do. Now, this is a formal interview inside of corporate. I don't know how you would react. I do suspect that I know how most people would react to this. It would involve some HR action, some smacking, either harder or softer. I can tell you what my reaction was, and I had the head of IT next to me. We ended up took a bit of deep breathing, but we set him up with a computer that was on its own switch port. It was isolated from the rest of the network, special computer, and we told him only an internet connection. And we told the guy, you know what? We love what you do. Keep checking all these viruses out. And what all we're asking in return, we're giving you a computer for that. We're asking in return is that you tell your buddies what you just saw. That was the most powerful awareness campaign I've ever done in my entire life. By the time that, this guy, he was so enthusiastic, he ended up in security later, right? But
no kidding. That's really cool.
Sales guy
transitioned
wow. into security, right?
Great story.
But he got everybody interested. I had I had 20 salespeople in an enterprise software company interested in security all of a sudden, because he was like, he had the outgoing personality, right? Salesperson. He was, kind of like telling me, oh, look, this is so cool. Look, it opens all these like weird porno on my thing, whatever, right? and it was great. It was very, very powerful. Not exactly the approach you will see in the vast majority of awareness or HR sort of response programs, or the thinking that you see in security teams. So that's sort of where I come from.
A cybersecurity curious mind is a terrible thing to waste. That's a great story. Yeah. Right? Yeah, that has to go in your next edition. That's great.
it's just, I have so many.
Yeah, you do. And speaking of having so many, so we are at the half hour point here. So we're going to go over if we're going to keep. Is that okay for you, Barak? How's your time
Sure.
going?
Yeah,
Okay.
all good.
So I think we'll probably wind up taking a full hour here. So people, if folks do want to send questions, please feel free to do so as we're going along here. So second story, tell us the actual story about the big red button library, chapter 4, and how it was handled by legal.
Right. So big red button library. So this is a thing we usually we used to recommend a lot. We still do ultimately because of privacy. But this was when GDPR wasn't even drafted yet, right? There were the noises where it's going to be new rules in Europe and it's going to be a thing, and there was a commission set up, but the rules weren't drafted yet. We got wind of them, and we were working with this global company, a multinational, very loud household name, and the engineering team invited us to talk about the design of the new product. Something I'm very proud of, that we're able to get to the point where engineering will advise us to give the security feedback. Usually a problem to do with a lot of engineering teams, like a thinking mindset. And because we were aware that these privacy rules were coming into play, we didn't know exactly what they would look like. We suggested they build, we called it the big red button library, which the idea behind it was build your data stores in such a way that every bit of data associated with the user would have some sort of like internal key, right? And then if at any point you have to delete the information related to that user or anonymize it everywhere in the infrastructure, you call the big red button library, you submit that key, and the library knows how to go to all the various data stores in the infrastructure and remove that information very cleanly, very easily. And engineering was very excited about it. They're like, holy shit, we wouldn't have thought about this. Since we're at the design stage, we're just starting to write the code. We can do this very easily. It's an easy implementation for us to do. Everybody's happy. I'm happy for sure, right? Our corporate sponsor was happy. And we're like, hey, we did something good. Hard to do it. Hard to get that feeling when you're a consultant, by the way. And so the reason I bring this story up is a couple of weeks later, we had that very same lead engineer who had a team of like 60 engineers working for him, right? Not a small job. Came and basically told us that legal told him he can't do it. And then he went ahead and told us the legal told him that not only can't he do this, he needs to build the infrastructure and the data stores and all the everything around it, the entire ecosystem, in such a way that it is practically impossible. Legal was targeting impossible to remove the information about a single user in any easy way.
Wow.
They literally wanted to make it as difficult as possible. Which was interesting. And when we asked about it, when we inquired about it, we got the legal theory, which I presume makes sense, right? I don't know, I'm not a lawyer, that there's going to be an escape hatch in any such rule, like GDPR basically says, if the business is going to be harmed by taking such privacy-oriented action, then it can do less than that. It can do what's reasonable for the business to do. And so what legal was basically trying to do is get to where they wanted, right? Which is continue to keep people's data forever in some way, shape, or form. So if you made it as difficult as possible to remove it, then they assumed, and I think they're right still, that GDPR would give them that escape hatch. That's sort of the origin of this story. What I'm going to read is the excerpt where, after I've described this in a lot more detail and color, this is sort of the ending to that, the conclusion. The reason I told you this story is not because it ended up in disaster. It mostly did not, for all I can tell, because they had bigger issues, but rather to point out that this sort of decision-making around information security is fairly common. It happens every day, pretty much everywhere, which is after all the theme of this book. Taken individually, each such decision may seem perfectly reasonable, but put together across the entire landscape of networks and infrastructures, well, there's a reason why hacking is so profitable. It is, in fact, a direct outcome from one of the most fundamental principles of proper security management, as it is understood today, that security should be managed according to risk. Go ahead, look it up. Risk management is the foundation of the most respected standards, the best books, the talks by top speakers in the field. We can't fix it all, the theory goes, and therefore we should focus on things according to the risk they present. This is all well and fine and makes perfect sense, but for those of us who understand security a little differently as an adjunct people discipline, it leads to predestination. The decision of what constitutes an acceptable risk or how it should be prioritized is, of course, made by people. And people can never be impartial arbiters. People will often downplay risk because other things matter more, or the negative outcome is highly unlikely, and we generally all suck at this game. In one obvious example, we think nothing of driving our cars, a highly risky activity in comparison to taking a commercial flight, an activity of which quite a few of us are petrified. The reality, of course, is that all of these judgment calls, of which many are made daily across all organizations, are just that, judgment calls, no matter how many pretty charts and complicated formulas we put around them. And the vast majority of them play out the way we anticipated them to play out, further reinforcing and inflating our sense of having made the right calls. But the law of large numbers dictates that some of these bad scenarios will in fact play out. And when they do, well, fairly recently, SolarWinds, FireEye, and Equifax come to mind, but I'm sure that even if you've never been in the security field yourself, you can think of many others.
Oh boy, you opened up a can of worms with risk management.
Yes. Yeah, and you know, it's talk about you know, I'm looking for the self-congratulatory sort of like word here, right? Talk about hubris. Oh yeah, ISO is a great example of this, right? ISO 27001, the gold standard of risk governance, of company risk governance. Well, tell you something about ISO. ISO sort of pretends that with enough process, you can somehow encapsulate risk, you know, in a neutral, measurable way and govern your organization for security risk based on that measurement. It completely ignores. It is the encapsulation of the ignoring of the human element. ISO completely discards the human element. If you actually read the standard, as it has gone through the years, it completely ignores it. It's as if it doesn't exist. It's all about the process and the charts, which is nonsense. I think everybody understands internally, fundamentally, this is nonsense. The people that make the decisions are the actual people that are, you know, that are the arbiters of the risk. So, you know, it's why, you know, risk analysis, qualitative, quantitative, whatever you want to call it, any keyword you want to come up with, it still depends on people, even quantitative. At the end of the day, it's people plugging in the numbers and it's people's judgment that ends up influencing these numbers. If you could follow a strict process, right, and arrive at the same outcome each time, regardless of who's operating the process when it comes to risk, there would be no risk because we would already work it out of the system. Lo and behold, there's still risk. Everywhere, all the time, and it manifests in all sorts of different ways. You know why? It's not because the process is wrong. It's because the people that input information into the process are people. They're humans. You know, I come into the morning of the key risk analysis meeting, and my puppy died last night. You think I'm going to be particularly good at figuring out what the right answers are to things? Of course not. I'm going to be impacted. We are emotional creatures. Right? And those emotions drive how we think, how we act, the answers we will give you any given day. So it's the psychology of humans has such a large invisible impact here that it lets, and we all kind of like walk around, we're deluding ourselves that risk management is some sort of like practice that can be replicated consistently and accurately and reliably across different environments and groups of people. And that's nonsense. It's nonsense. It's the same idea about memory. You know, most people have this delusional idea that memory is a way to store events and details of events. It never was, never is, doesn't work that way. Go look up a little bit of neurobiology. Examine how brains operate. The only purpose of memory is to store emotions associated with an event, not to store the details of an event. And the reason the brain does this evolutionarily is to give you enough of a foundation so that if something sort of similar comes up in the future, the fuzzy boundary, right? That's the reason memories are not accurate. There's actually a really good evolutionary reason why memories are generally not accurate, even 1 second after they were formed. is the brain's purpose is to create an emotional response when something somewhat similar comes across your way in the future, so that the memory of the emotion that floats up from the brain at that point reminds you that you've sort of encountered it before and how you felt about it, so that you can kind of judge your action in the future. That's the reason memories exist. It's not to store events. That's why memories are unreliable. So same thing operates in risk management all the time. Oh, I remember this thing that happened and it was blah, 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 blah. So now I know what the answer is. But I also really, like, my stomach was upset this morning and I had too much to drink last night. And I discount the effect that that has on my ability to make those risk decisions. That's really what I'm trying to illustrate here. And it goes back again to the issue of security and how security as a field is so full of itself. It's so full of hubris by trying to constantly ignore the human actors in a real way. Good hackers know this. They're the ones who succeed in manipulating the manipulators, the operators of the system, right? That's why, again, social engineering is so powerful. That's why con men are so powerful. That's why a charming person will overcome any security system even if they know nothing about technology. Nothing at all. Be charismatic, charming, and know what you're after, and you will defeat any security system in the world, even if you don't even know how to operate a computer. And it happens over and over and over and over again. It will continue to happen forever, right? So we have to account for that in our risk management, but people don't. People say, oh, ISO gives me a framework and a standard that will negate all the risk. No, it's not. ISO serves itself and it has a purpose to some degree, but the reason you're doing ISO according to the ISO framework is in order to get the certificate from the ISO Foundation. It's not for any other reason. It's not, right? Anyhow, very long conversation here. I'm sorry. This is where I get to be a brat, right?
Wow, coming in hot on the ISO today.
Yeah.
No, that's really, really powerful stuff. And again, it's people all the way down. It's, you have a final story here. Well, actually, before we get to this final story, there is a question that Henry Figueroa asked a bit ago. Barak, how do you deal with your gut feeling versus data?
That's the question, right? That's what is it? With inflation, it's the $64 million question now.
Yeah.
So, one other thing I think that experience should teach you over time is that, and we touched on it a little bit earlier, that, and I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of thin slicing. So this is going to lead to a bit of a discussion, right? Thin slicing is the idea that the more experienced you become, the faster it is that you can reach a conclusion about a social situation or a decision you have to make, right? And Malcolm Gladwell wrote it in his, I think it was his first book before he became super famous. He introduced the concept of thin slicing, right? How quickly can you kind of cut through the bullshit and figure out, oh, the person I just shook his hand, in the first 5 seconds of meeting him or her, do I trust them or do I not trust them, right? That sort of, and the more you age, the more experience you get, the scenarios you encounter, the faster you're going to have that gut feeling that basically your memory is going to float sort of what we talked about earlier. It's going to float a sort of a hybrid emotion associated with this kind of circumstance. That's your gut feeling, and it's going to give you a sense of whether this is good or bad, right? By the way, doesn't mean that two people will reach the same gut feeling about a situation, but they will. Humans are all humans are made of the same machine. It's just a matter of which inputs each one gets, which determines which outputs come out in the end, right? So different inputs would lead to different outputs, and they may get a different internal reaction. And we call it a gut feeling. We call it a lot of things. The challenge is that the better you become at something, the more your gut feeling is reliable and the faster it arrives. And the more right it is over time, right? The more accurate it becomes. So your reactions reinforce themselves. The risk is that ever so often they're going to spectacularly fail. That's the first story I shared with Dudley, right? And so this is where data does come into play, and that's why I love that question. is because it's a way to check yourself to some degree, right? It's a way to say, okay, and I don't go to data first. A lot of people, I think, make the mistakes of going to the data first. I don't. I think that's the wrong approach. The right approach is, let me get, especially if you're experienced, right? Especially if you do have that wealth of life and exposure that's been associated over decades, trust your gut. Your gut is going to tell you good things generally, usually, not always. But then use the data to check yourself. And this is why in incident response, the calmness matters so much. Because if all we do is go on the gut feeling and react, we're going to react with fear. And fear, induces panic and all of these terrible dynamics that people deal with. So I close my eyes and listen to what's happening, right? I'm sitting there as the person who needs to decide what to do next, right? Tell me what's going on. Let me feel through it. Let me understand what my gut reaction is. Okay, I've done that. I have an idea of where I think I should be going, where I think the company should be going. Now give me a few minutes to check the data. That's really how these things should interact with each other, not the other way around. The data cannot dictate my gut feeling. It shouldn't, because typically as humans, we are so good at doing this, and the data isn't good at showing or teasing out these insights that are based on past experience. It can't, right? It stands in a vacuum. It's a data about a thing that's happening right now. So you have to let your capabilities show, but then you can use the data to kind of like, holy shit, did I miss something really big here, right? Don't stand too much on that principle. Ultimately, you can't spend days and days and days when the breach is unfolding looking at the data, but you can certainly afford a little bit of time to kind of check your reactions and then proceed. Sometimes, ever so often, if you're honest with yourself and you're not too full of yourself, right? The data will tell you, maybe I got the wrong reaction this time. It's not going to happen often. Again, the more experienced you are, it's going to happen less and less, but it can. And those moments, those are the truly cherished moments when you know, holy shit, I'm about to go really badly wrong.
Spoken like an expert. I guess it takes some time to develop that gut instinct, but I think that makes a lot of sense. The Malcolm Gladwell book that you're referencing, it's going to drive me nuts now. I really enjoyed it. I know what you're talking about. I remember some of the things there, but
I remember the name of the book, but it's a very famous book, right?
Right.
Yep.
It's not Blink. Oh, it is. Is it Blink?
It is Blink. Blink.
Yeah, it's
Blink.
Blink.
It is Blink.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
Blink.
that's one.
There you go.
Yeah.
Blink.
Okay. Awesome stuff. Well, hey, let's send this off in style. Tell us a funny story. Do you have anything? You're the chief geek and founder of eImmune, your boutique cybersecurity agency. Tell us some good, strong geeky humor, some kind of a story that really brings it all home.
I have an excerpt from the book, shockingly.
Perfect.
I know. So this is just to kind of end on a lighter note. And this is again something that happened for real. The phone rings. Hey, Barak, says one of my longtime colleagues and friends who runs his own consulting practice that specializes in information security. We have a bit of a weird problem with one of our customers, and I was wondering if maybe you had some ideas for me. Now, my friends, if you have stuck with me so far in this book, you know that these are the best conversations, at least when it comes to the potential generation of future stories for books that I might end up writing. This call was, of course, no exception. What's up? I ask, my funny bone starting to hum that little tune. So, we're working with these guys, he says, and then names them. Big company, big company, retailer, household name. And we're helping them with their PCI project, he adds. The hum gets louder, at least in my head. This fellow knows his stuff. If he is calling me to ask me about it, then it is guaranteed to be a real stumper. Anyway, you know how PCI needs all credit card numbers to be encrypted, he asks rhetorically, but I answer anyway, if only to distract myself from that incessant hum. Put another way, I am trying really hard not to laugh in anticipation. Yeah, that little thing, sure. So I add, dangling that big old question mark in the air. Well, he says in a tone of incredulity. See, they have these custom point of sale systems, and he takes a pause for dramatic effect. Oh, it's getting fun. Point of sale systems are one of those things. They are essential, critical piping for consumer-facing businesses with a physical presence, and yet they rarely get upgraded. And they want us to help them figure out how to encrypt the card numbers on them. He pauses again. Mind you, this conversation was taking place circa 2010. Yes, this fact is important, quite. Right, I say, so how can I help you? Well, he says again, these systems haven't been upgraded in a while. They're a little, old. How old? I ask. Windows 2000 old? Older, he says. Windows 95, I muse? Yes, no, older, he responds, and I can hear the chuckle developing in his voice. Windows 3.11, I blurt out incredulously. Close, but no cigar, he says before dropping the hammer. They are using a system running on DOS 5.
All
A
right.
second passes in silence. Then we both burst out laughing. So, he says after catching his breath, know how to encrypt credit card numbers on that? I must confess that I did not.
DOS 5.
Yes.
All right.
Yes, I know. Isn't that brilliant?
That is a challenge to security. All right.
Yep. I don't know what they ended up doing, but I certainly didn't have an idea. No, it was just one of those, absurd calls of which, again, you talk about why I wrote Security Hippie. I run into these situations so often that it's just some of them are great, and people should enjoy them too. That's sort of where that whole premise came from, right? I can't just hold it to myself. Everybody has to get these things because they're crazy, and they happen all the time. Ultimately, they happen all the time. That's the reality. This is all over the place, right? 20 years not upgraded because 2010, so DOS 5, yeah, it's about 20 years, 2 decades. Point of sale systems not updated for 20 years. That's not that atypical, ultimately.
Yeah, right.
That's true for a lot of mission critical systems out there.
Right. Awesome. Barak, it has been a pleasure having you here. And for everyone listening, and whether you're listening now or whether you're listening on delay, you will have a link to get Barak's book, The Security Hippie. I encourage you to read it. It's full of great stories, and all the stories really do come together. And from this conversation we just had, the common element in so many of your stories, maybe all of them to some degree, is people, and the fact that there is this human element in cybersecurity that's so often overlooked. And Barak brings in, the good, the bad, the ugly, and the hilarious all around cybersecurity, but through these different stories that involve people and how they interact in this industry. So very much appreciated. Thanks for coming. Thanks for writing your book.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Okay. All right. Well, we will catch you again next time. Thank you.